Hi, welcome to the Crafts channel. My name's Corinne Brad, and if you've seen a previous video that I've done showing you the simple assembly of blocks to make a block quilt, rather like this one, just very simple squares. If you haven't seen that one, I will endeavour to put a link to it underneath this one so you can find it more easily. But essentially what I've done is I've created a patchwork of squares. Now, if you have seen the other video, you'll notice this is completely different fabric. And I've made this smaller just so that I can make the demonstration much quicker. So you've made your patchwork of squares. They're all lined up on their seams, given it a good press. What you need to do is you need to find some quilt wadding. Now, you can use like the poly wadding, or I've got some here which is 100% cotton. This is a Vliseline 277, I believe, which is a lovely, it doesn't look very thick, but it's really warm. So you just lay your quilted panel on top of that. And I'm going to back it with a piece of, yes, you've guessed it, old sheet from a charity shop. Because I've found that's the cheapest way to buy decent cotton. Now, this actually is a poly cotton. I don't normally use poly cotton for backing my quilts with, but this is simply going to become a sewing machine mat for me. So I'm not so bothered about it not being 100% cotton. So you can see I've got quite a lot of wastage here. That is just purely to show you the layers. So you've got your patchwork, you've got your wadding, you've got your backing fabric. And then if you pin these pieces together, at fairly regular intervals, and if you're making a full-size quilt, you will actually want to pin together at very regular intervals, especially actually on your corners. And ideally, you want to try and put it on as large a flat surface as you can, like living room floor or a large work table if you're lucky enough to have one. And I'm just going to trim the excess backing off here. But I'm not going to bother trimming up the wadding and the rest of the backing, because I sometimes find things shift as I sew. And if you find that things shift as you sew, that's all the more reason to stick a few more pins in here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to top stitch this quilt through all three layers. And that's what quilting is essentially. It's joining a top layer to the layers of wadding and the backing layer. And I'm going to start in the middle, and then I'm going to go sideways, and then either side, sideways, and either side. And that way, if I muck it up, every error is being pushed out to the edges. So if my backing fabric starts shifting, it will shift out, and it will mean it should be ruck free on the underside. That's the plan. So, grab your sewing machine. I'm going to set this on a 3mm long stitch, and I will just show you what I'm going to line up to on here. There is, I don't know if you can see that on the overhead, but there is a definite centre line on my foot here. So when I run along the machine, I need to make sure that that centre line is on the joining seam line. I'm going to use a white thread so you can see what I'm doing. Sometimes it is better to use a coordinating thread, because if you do make mistakes, it's actually not as visible as plain white. But I like to show you my mistakes so that you don't have to make them. So just pop your quilt, or your layers of your quilt in your sewing machine, lock stitch it. Make sure that all your layers are flat and not rocked up. Make sure it's perpendicular in your machine. And really, you should be able to let the feed dogs do the work for you. And this method is called stitching in the ditch, because you're stitching along that seam line. And where you do it well, like this bit here, your stitching is pretty much invisible. Where you've slightly off centre, you can see the stitching. But from a distance, you won't see it at all. So I'm now going to go 90 degrees. I've now just pulled the thread out of my sewing machine needle. Now let me just rethread that. I have the utmost respect for the person that developed the needle threader on the sewing machine. It has saved me so many hours of trauma. And when you sew, always try and put the least amount of fabric inside the neck of your sewing machine. I'm calling it a neck. I'm not 100% sure that's its correct term. That's not, it's called an arm. And that's why you get long arm sewing machines specifically for quilting. So that's one side, and then I'm just going to turn it around and do the other side. And then I'm going to show you the back of the work. Let's just take some of these pins out that I don't need at the minute. So I've sewn this one and these two. And if you look behind, you can see what I mean about working from the outside. Because as I've stitched, I've managed to bend that line slightly because I was working in this direction and I didn't flatten this out enough. When I came to this seam here, I'd got a little bit too much fabric, so I've had to stretch it out. So before I go any further, I'm just going to repin that fabric. To make sure that it stays completely flat. And on a small piece like this, it doesn't make a lot of difference. But on a larger quilt, sometimes by the time you get to the end of it, it does make a lot of difference. And that's why a lot of people will use what's called a walking foot. Because depending on the pressure of your pressed foot, and depending on how clean your sole plate is, and how you're handling the fabric, you may find that these layers will just shift against each other as you work. I've never used a walking foot, I'll be honest. I hear they are fantastic because what they do is they actually move the top and bottom layers of fabric at the same time. Whereas your bottom layer of fabric is being moved by the feed dogs, your top layer is just sliding under that foot. So actually what I could do, if I take the tension off the foot a little bit, you might find that it will feed the fabric through without it catching. So I'm just going to sew these other seams, and then we'll have a look and see quite how badly I've mucked it up on the back. Also, another tip is when you cut the threads at the end of your line of sewing, don't cut them so close to the needle that when you next take a stitch, it comes unthreaded. All right, so there you go. That's the quickest bit of top stitching I've done in a long time. And I haven't taken as much care and attention as I should have done. But if you look at the back, after that initial out of kilter line, the rest of it is actually quite square because you've worked from the centre out. So don't look too much closely at my top stitching. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to trim up the edges of the backing and the wadding to the size of the quilt. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to show you an easy method of binding your quilt. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again very soon. If you've been inspired to create, please share your makes with us in the comments section below. And if you've enjoyed videos by the Crafts channel, hit the like button. Want to see more of us? Then click subscribe. See you next time.